So in part one of the of this series, um, I talked about some of the ways that we can reach conservatives and members of the Republican Party on the issue of climate change. And I started by saying that even though I am a leftist, I reject the Naomi Klein idea that the only um, workable solutions to climate change involve changes to our social and economic system. Now, however much one may want those kinds of changes to our social and economic system, we need to disentangle those objectives from uh, the objective of getting greenhouse gases, of preventing the release of greenhouse gases as soon as we possibly can, and also of potentially drawing down some of the greenhouse gases that have already been emitted. So those objectives are scientific objectives, which Margaret Thatcher has supported. She supported that when she was alive, um, and many very wealthy people who are very much in favor of the free enterprise system, very strongly in favor of it, ranging from Bill Gates to, yes, Elon Musk. It may be hard to remember this given some of his more recent antics, but this is still, even today, a long-standing objective of Musk's, of any number of people who I may disagree with on most issues, but nevertheless, we can agree that climate change is a serious threat. Now, around 28% of Republicans would agree with that statement, and another 37% of Republicans uh, would say that it is a minor threat. And then there are 33% of Republicans who would say that it is no threat at all. Now, so far, the problem has been that 37% who think it's a minor threat tend to align with the no threat at all group. Certainly, there are people within that 37% who would say it's a minor threat who would also probably say that um, even though it's real, it isn't necessarily caused by human activity. Um, but there are those who do think that it is a real situation. It's caused by human activity. Maybe the impact isn't as large as um, it's being portrayed uh, by scientists and so on. Um, or maybe the science is being misrepresented and sensationalized, and sometimes it is sensationalized. Um, but the only sensationalism comes from people who are basically nihilists, who basically take the view that we've already done so much damage to the environment that and we've already set so many feedback loops in motion that we are past a point of no return and there's no real point in doing anything now. So I have a video about climate fatalism which addresses that argument, which may also hold sway even with the 28% of Republicans who consider it to be a serious threat. There may be some among them who are willing to vote for politicians who do not take that threat seriously because they believe that, yes, it is a serious threat. It's just as bad as the scientists say. In fact, it's even worse. Our goose is cooked. Game over. Let's focus on immigration instead. Well, if you look at what we're seeing from the IPCC, and if you look at what the best climate science is saying, it is that we have the geophysical capacity to keep warming down potentially to 1.5 degrees Celsius, although that's debatable whether we still have the capacity to do that. We might only have the capacity to keep it to 1.6 um, or 1.7. Um, and we don't really know, right? What we know about is the effect that emissions has on climate. We don't know exactly how sensitive the climate is to emissions. We don't know precisely what the climate sensitivity is. We don't know precisely how irreversible feedback loops are. there's a lot in the feedback loop field where it's not definitive, but where it behooves us, um, really, to do everything that we can, to get the best outcome possible, especially because when some economists might say, oh, well, the best outcome with the least amount of cost is if we just keep global warming to 3 degrees, what they might really unintentionally be advocating is a policy that, combined with feedback loops, could lead to warming of much more than 3 degrees, especially if we look out a few centuries into the future rather than just the end of this coming century. What we have seen from climate action has been that climate action in the United States, in the European Union, in China, even in India, is that climate action has been very consequential and highly insufficient. And that's a combination that we need to keep in mind because uh, both parts of that coin are equally important. Highly consequential and woefully insufficient. Because what that reminds us is that there is more for us to do, there's more that is feasible for us to do, and there's more that we can do, right? I mentioned China. China has introduced some of the world's largest carbon markets, and is looking into greening the Gobi Desert, and is taking the lead on renewables and also on coal consumption. They are nowhere near where they need to be, right? Highly consequential and woefully insufficient. That describes China, that describes the European Union, that describes the United States. But the point is that a lot is being done and much more needs to be done. And it's plausible for us to do it. So that's one key point to just get right out of the gate, because I think what's even more insidious than the denial of climate science, which at this point only really holds full sway with 1/3 of the Republican Party, so about 1/3 of 1/3 of the population, right? That's where it really holds the most sway. But what's really concerning is, climate fatalism. That's one scientific point to address, right? The other point, again, addressed to conservatives specifically, which I talk about in part 1 of this video, is that in the video series, is that there there are many solutions to climate change which are compatible with the free enterprise system. That's why Margaret Thatcher, when she was alive, was supportive of strong climate action. That's why the UK Conservative Party is still taking a lot of climate action. Not nearly enough, but they're certainly doing much more, a lot more than the US Republican Party on this issue. And there are market-based solutions to this issue. Yes, incentives. Yes, they involve some government intervention, but they certainly leave the free enterprise system intact, and while making it more costly, either through a cap and trade system, which has its problems, or a carbon tax system, which has its problems, or another solution which is more regulatory in nature, which I think is probably the best approach for a number of reasons. What is called the flexible regulation. So a prescriptive regulate, it's not flexible in the sense that it's flexible about how much you reduce the emissions. It's very clear on that. But it is flexible about what technologies you use to reduce emissions. So a prescriptive regulation basically says, okay, X business is going to use Y technology. You will use solar panels or whatever. A flexible regulation says, okay, utilities, energy companies, and so on. X share of your energy mix will be coming from clean sources. Note, clean is different from renewable, right? Clean includes renewables, and it also includes nuclear fission power and a number of other options which would be clean. Even potentially, if you actually have carbon sequestration and storage technology that works and is scalable, and we're not quite at that point yet, but if you can develop that, it could even involve burning coal, but only if you actually have sequestration and storage technology that works. So mandate that X percentage of the energy supply has to be coming from clean sources by Y year, right? Now, this is something which is even being done on the wrong scale with thresholds that are far too low um, in states like Texas and Oklahoma, and have been, and states like Texas have been doing this since 1999 when George Bush was in power. I mean, if you can imagine George Bush uh, introducing a renewable portfolio standard, he did. In Texas, it was a renewable portfolio and not a clean portfolio. So it was actually more restrictive in that sense. But the share of the electricity mix in Texas that was covered by that was certainly far too low. Um, but that's a solution which is much harder to politicize, I think. Um, and even though I have many issues with technocracy, I also think that in some ways climate might be the kind of issue where technocracy is really going to be what deals with this um, more than just um, the, a more politicized process. But I might be wrong about that. I mean, I have many qualms with the technocratic approach to just about anything. But again, if you're looking at this from a conservative perspective, a flexible regulation, yes, it's regulation. Yes, it is an intervention by government into the marketplace, um, but it allows individuals and businesses and private entities of all kinds to decide for themselves which course they're going to take, which clean option they're going to go with, and ultimately the best technologies win out because you don't have some bureaucrats deciding, oh, I like this technology more than the others in advance before we see how they perform. I mean, we already have seen how these technologies perform, but what I mean is, before we see how different technologies perform at a greater scale, instead of having a bureaucrat say, I like this one, a flex reg allows the business to decide, okay, we're going to go with this, or we're going to go with this, or we're going to go with this. We have options. Um, and we have some time to implement options. Now, how much time? Time is running short, and I think we need to have some aggressive standards even for 2030 and 2035, very aggressive standards. Um, but whatever you may think of these solutions from a conservative standpoint, um, one thing that they don't do, one thing that they do not carry any potential of doing, is overthrowing the capitalist system or the free enterprise system. Property is still owned privately. Um, when when these solutions are implemented to their maximal extent, right? Whether we're talking about putting a price on carbon, or a cap and trade system, or a flexible regulation system, which, by the way, comes tax free, right? You don't even have to pay a carbon tax um, as part of this, as part of a flex reg approach. Um, so that is something which I think could appeal to conservatives if and only if conservatives see that there are some concerns of theirs which are even larger than whatever concerns you would have with, say, a flex reg approach or a cap and trade or carbon tax approach. Now, what would those concerns be? At this point, it's not the physical impact of climate change. Let's say you're in that golden 37% group, which I say golden because in a sense, you hold the balance of the Republican Party right now, and you believe that climate change is real, but you don't believe that it's as big a threat as those libs tell you it is, right? Well, or even as 28% of your own Republican Party members believe it to be, incidentally. Um, so if you're in that camp, let's look at the way that climate impacts are connected to things that you are concerned about. So, for instance, you might be concerned about migration, right? This is the go-to thing. Probably heard this before, but it's worth pointing out. I'm going to list out a few other things maybe you haven't considered. in a humble way. I'm, not trying to be condescending when I say that. But first, I'm sure you've heard about this though, that as climate change gets worse, more people need to leave where they are living, right? And as sea levels rise, for instance, as people experience more drought, as people experience more wildfire, as soil in Pakistan that is not being flooded is just growing more saline, a number of things are happening. A number of climate related stressors are acting as push factors that are pushing people out of their homes. And the developing world and the underdeveloped world and the global south, whichever term you think is best, um, is not as well equipped to deal with the effects of climate change as the global north. The global north is going to get hit really badly. The global south is going to be hit all the worse, right? Now, from a conservative perspective, what this means is that whether you like it or not, there are going to be large groups of people from the developing world, from the underdeveloped world, the global south. We already are seeing this, right? But it's only going to be getting larger. More and more people are going to be pushed from where they are living and into the West, into Western Europe, into the United States and the Western offshoots and Canada, Australia, and so on. Climate refugees uh, already exist. There are going to be a growing number of climate refugees. Now, in my view, I think that I'm sure that I would have a disagreement with somebody who's conservative about what we should do as refugees are reaching our shores. We're going to have a disagreement about that, and that's fine. The point, well, you know, um, the whatever you might say about that disagreement, the point is this: the more climate is disrupted, the greater number of refugees there will be, right? And so if we keep warming down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, yes, there will be refugees. There will not be as many refugees. Um, Also, when you factor in that people are being displaced internally, we're going to have refugees from South Florida, from your own country, and you'll care about them because they're your own countrymen, I guess. Um, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be condescending, but I look, all cards on the table. Yes, I see the world differently than American conservatives do. Um, sure, I mean, there's no secret in that. That's very clear if you watch my videos. Um, but this is one concern which you might have. Maybe you don't care as much about rising sea levels until you realize that they cause people to leave where they live in. Maybe you don't care as much about droughts or rising food prices across the globe and so on. Maybe you think, oh, we can weather that. That's going to be fine. But maybe you do care about how those stressors push people into the kinds of countries that have more resources to more adequately deal with those stressors. And maybe you care about um, the problem of the problem. Again, we would have an argument about this, right? But maybe immigration is a higher concern of yours than climate change, even if you think climate change is real. Um, Even if you see it's real, it's caused by human activity. We have the ability to limit it dramatically. But maybe the impacts aren't quite as real to you as immigration. Well, again, more climate change, more climate disruption means more immigration. Preventing climate impacts means reducing the total number of people who will be trying to migrate to the United States, to Canada, Australia, etc. Okay, that's point one. Actually, point one was that there are solutions that are compatible with the capitalist system. Point two is that climate change causes migration. Point three, the effects of climate change on politics. Think about this for a moment, because in a few decades from now, those millennials, some of whom are conservative, and some of whom are extremely conservative, and Gen Zers, some of whom are very conservative, like Nick Fuentes, right? But generally speaking, that isn't the case. Um, those are going to be the older voters, right? The millennials and the Zoomers. A few decades from now, will be the oldest voters. Um, Now, there's a tendency for people to grow more conservative with age. However, some recent studies have found that um, millennials are not conservatizing with age. Um, that is not happening amongst the older 40-year-old millennials. Um, and uh, a big factor here is climate change, right? So, one thing that may prevent the conservatization, you know, conservatization, but might prevent, you know, millennials and Gen Zers and so on to grow more conservative as they get older is concern about climate change, especially if the major political party representing the conservative movement continues to fail to take the climate issue seriously, right? Um, and if anything, that failure um, and the worsening impacts of climate change may radicalize many people and push many people not only to the Democratic Party, but perhaps even to the far left, right? So the political landscape of the future um, is bleaker for conservatism uh, if two conditions occur. The first condition is if the main institutions of U.S. conservatism, like the Republican Party, are finding every excuse not to take serious action on climate change. Uh, that does not bode well for the future of the conservative movement when climate impacts are getting worse. And the other thing is that the worse that the climate impacts get in the future, the more upsetting it will be. And alarmism, I know alarmism is sort of a buzzword for those who think that okay, it's a problem, but it's not as serious a problem as you're saying. But the impacts are getting worse, and yes, people will be alarmed. And no, I don't think that's a good thing, because I think that as seriously as we ought to take this issue, I would hope that we address the problem in a rational way. And rational could mean in a very thorough way, right? But, and I think it does mean a very thorough, a very aggressive approach. But you do want the response to be rational. Now, you think about the mitigation end and you think about the adaptation end. On both the mitigation, which means prevention, I know it doesn't quite sound like prevention, but on both the mitigation and the adaptation end, the worse this gets in the next few decades, the less likely you're going to have a rational response. The more likely people are going to be willing to embrace solutions which are even abhorrent to those of us like me who like the idea of a Green New Deal, for instance. And by the way, if you're conservative and so on, you want to embrace climate action, Margaret Thatcher style, UK Conservative Party style. Again, I'm encouraging you to do that. I'm encouraging you to propose that alternative to a Green New Deal, even though I think a Green New Deal is the best approach, right? I want a contest between the Green New Deal and a solution that's more based on market incentives. I want that to be the battle, a battle between a just transition, so-called, and which I believe in. I call it so. I don't know. I'm trying to address a lot of people in this video. But I want a contest between an approach which would not only deal with climate change but also deal with all of the social problems involved with dealing with climate change, and an approach which is just more focused on shifting markets towards emitting less and eventually eliminating these kinds of emissions. I want that to be the contest. I don't want it to be a contest between say, a Green New Deal and no solution at all. So anyway, where was I? Where was I? Right. But in 2050, what are people going to be willing to do as things are getting worse? Remember, again, the generational landscape is different. And up until now, the trends have shown us that we can't, if you're coming from a conservative perspective, you cannot count on millennials and Gen Z people to grow more conservative with age. That might change. But one thing which will make it harder for that to change, again, is the climate issue, especially as the impacts get worse. What are people willing to do in 2050 if we don't address the issue today? The solutions are much more expensive on the mitigation and the adaptation side, right? The less we do now, the more expensive it is in the future. But there are some people who take, say, the Bjorn Lomborg position, which is basically, well, sure, climate change is a real problem. Sure, we need to do something about it, but we should really pinch our pennies as we find the solutions to this problem. I think the problem with that is that there are some solutions to climate change that are extremely cost effective, and there are some solutions to climate change which do involve a large upfront investment, but which will pay off. And there are some which are putting bad money after bad ideas. There are thousands of different things we could be doing, and there are far fewer thousands of things we should be doing, right? But pinching pennies when dealing with an existential threat, we weren't pinching pennies in the war against Nazi Germany. And again, I know I'm addressing people who might be in the take the view that this is a minor threat. And current projections are that we're looking at a 3.1, 3.2 degree to 2.4 degree increase Celsius by the end of this century. Then, what about 2200? What about 2300? Especially when we factor in positive feedback loops. We have already, with the actions we've taken, we've probably moved to the point where climate change is an existential threat to humanity. We've probably moved it back by a century. But that does not change the fact that the existential nature of this threat is still looming over us. Now, again, you may completely disagree with me on that point. There are probably 5 ways to look at the cost of climate action. The first is the actual cost of any given action that is taken to prevent the impacts of climate change. The second, and again, there are ethical questions about whether any cost-benefit analysis is even suitable to this issue, because there are many areas where climate costs cannot be quantified. There are some climate costs that are very easy to quantify, and there are some that are impossible to quantify. But anyway, the first is the cost of the action. The second is the avoided cost of avoided climate impacts. The third is the independently positive impacts of action. What I mean by this is impacts of climate action that are independent of avoided climate costs that are still positive. For instance, in the Inflation Reduction Act, record level investments in clean energy technologies and so on. With that on the books and being enforced currently, we are seeing, and not only with that, but also with other legislation like the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act, what we are seeing as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the CHIPS Act is more jobs being onshored, on net, into the American economy than being offshored, right? So job creation is already something that we are seeing in the renewable energy field and in renewable manufacturing and manufacturing that's renewables adjacent and so on. We're seeing more jobs being created as we speak because of the public investments we're making in these energy sectors. We are also seeing an increase in what was I about to say? Right. Another positive impact, which is independent of what happens with climate change, and whether or not you even believe climate change is happening, you might think this is a positive impact, is that as we shift to cleaner sources of energy, we are reducing the amount of pollution that we are breathing. And this is saving lives. And it is also, if you're looking at it in a purely monetary way, which I wouldn't, frankly, but if you are, it saves a lot of money in health costs, including health costs that are borne by the government. If you're concerned about how much money government spends on healthcare, the more we clean the air, the fewer people are going to need care to deal with their asthma, because fewer people will have asthma. To give you one example. And yes, studies show that this is a matter of life and death for many people globally, that we're talking about roughly 7 million people, roughly a year, who die from pollution. Now, granted, when we're talking about outdoor air pollution, which is largely industrial in nature, that kills around 3 million people around the world. There's a study which found that if the Biden clean electricity standard was allowed to remain in his bill, that would have saved, what was it, well over 100,000 lives in the United States. Certainly it was over 100,000 lives, right? Human beings would get a chance at life for a longer period of time. You're pro-life. Again, 100,000 people whose lives we can save in the coming decades in our own country, and potentially 3 million lives whose lives we could be saved around the world if you look at industrial air pollution. And also, another thing that will help us deal with climate change, even though it doesn't have to do with industry, is investing in making clean cook stoves technologies available in developing countries. And there was this huge firestorm about shifting from gas stoves to electric stoves, and certainly that shift is probably going to save some lives. The main thing that's going to save lives is bringing an end to the practice of cooking in these indoor stoves, with these indoor stoves that don't even have chimneys, in developing economies, making safer cooking technologies available to the 2 billion people who do not have access to them at this point, could save around 3 million lives a year. And we could do it quite cheaply. And even if we couldn't, there's kind of I would argue that we kind of have a moral imperative. But again, I know I'm addressing people who might not be there on that wavelength yet. It also has the impact of reducing emissions. And so, sometimes there's the idea that, well, there are these inevitable trade-offs between development and human development in the global south, for instance, and climate action. Even though climate impacts hit the developing world and the underdeveloped economies and so on much harder, they hit us plenty hard already in developed economies, but all the harder in those economies. And even though we do see many instances like the clean stove solution, where what we're doing is dealing with multiple issues at the same time, including improving human development outcomes in the developing world. Again, to pivot back to some things that are really close to the concerns of people in the American Republican Party. So I mentioned that the solution doesn't have to be incompatible with the capitalist system. I mentioned that and that there are market-based solutions to this issue. I mentioned that the more that we emit, the more there's going to be, and the more climate impacts hit, uh, the more people are going to be seeking refuge in countries that have the capacity to better deal with climate impacts. Um, and so there's going to be a large influx of migration as a result of that. And it's going to happen one way or the other, but it's certainly going to be much larger if we allow um, climate change to hit its maximal levels of impact, right? Than if we can minimize it as much as possible. Um, and then there is the issue of the future political landscape, which is definitely going to be impacted by millennials and Gen Zers and younger people than that, even as we age, reacting to increasingly obvious and, yes, terrifying climate impacts. At this point, around 62% of people, according to that same PBS poll I was showing in part one of the video, around 62% of Americans, I should be precise, I shouldn't just say people, right? We're talking specifically about people in the United States, who already see climate change impacting their local communities. Now, as the effects get worse, that number is going up. Whether you like it or not, that number is going up. And as the effects get worse, people are going to be more and more willing to not only back progressive causes, especially if conservatism does not offer its alternative that is credible as an alternative that would actually drive down emissions. But here's another thing. I mentioned this very briefly a few minutes ago. People will be more willing to, for one thing, implement mitigation strategies that are more expensive. So, if you think that the Green New Deal is expensive, just you wait to see what people will be willing to do in 2050 if we don't do anything now. What are people going to do in 2050 to not only deal with the impact over the next few decades from there, but where we'll be in 2100 or where we'll be in 2050. What are people going to be willing to do when they are seeing intense climate impacts over the next couple decades? Now, sometimes people will be more willing to take actions which I would consider to be the most sensible, right? Like Green New Deal kind of policies, which, by the way, again, will probably be much more expensive if they're implemented starting in 2050 than if they're implemented today. However much you may dislike the scale of that or the expense of that. But it's all the more expensive a few decades from now if we don't start now. That's one part of it. Adaptation also becomes much more expensive. It's going to be a much bigger fiscal drain. You're concerned about deficits and so on. The costs of adapting to the impact of climate change, some of which will certainly be borne by the private sector, by individuals, some of which, like you and your children, some of which will be borne by the public treasuries of the world. Again, even if you don't like the idea of spending money to prevent impact, the cost of dealing with impact is going to continue rising. Again, that's going to be something we will have to spend money. And again, that gets more expensive the worse the situation is. The less that we prevent now, the more expensive that is in the future. But then there's another aspect of this. Not only do the solutions on the prevention side and the adaptation side grow more expensive, but again, the more desperate we allow things to get before we take the issue seriously, the more likely people will be willing to not only take the actions which are required to deal with the problem, but people might take actions which, again, even people like me who support the Green New Deal are certainly not currently prepared to take. Actions which might involve much more intrusive interventions by the government than anything proposed in a clean energy standard or a Green New Deal. Um, Let me give you an example. Cars, right? So, in my view, we should be actively subsidizing electric vehicles. Um, we should make it easier for people to transition away from gas to electric vehicles. We should make it financially better to drive electric than to drive gas. And we're not there yet. It's currently, in many cases, much cheaper to have a gas car. Um, and but but we need to shift the incentives on that, right? I'd also say that I believe very strongly in mass transit, and there are some people who take that further and say we shouldn't even be investing in electric vehicles because we need to completely focus on mass transit, and I don't think that's realistic. I think um, that at least at this point, you know, people aren't ready to just go from having a gas car to using mass transit. Certainly in the countryside, um, in certain rural areas, that will never be a possibility. And in urban areas, we do, but in urban areas, I would say we do need to make mass transit much more attractive, and we need to invest very strongly in it. We need to make it not only more attractive by making it perhaps more comfortable, but also making it something that's much more available and accessible. You know, you want people to be able to hop on a bus at their location every 2 minutes. Um, you want that because that makes people more willing to hop a bus. Um, and so where we're at right now, um, even us Green New Dealer types, is let's make the investments, let's make the incentives, let's align the incentives in a way where electric vehicles become more attractive than gas vehicles, and where mass transit becomes even more attractive vis-a-vis electric vehicles. And that's where we're at in 2023. If we don't do anything now in those directions, how desperate is the situation in 2050? I mean, it could be desperate enough. People could be desperate enough. I'm not endorsing this idea, but people could be desperate enough to basically mandate that you surrender your privately owned car, right? Again, I'm not supporting that idea. I'm just saying that that's an infringement on personal choice, which is going to be on the menu. It's going to be something that people will be seriously considering as they're reacting to the worst kinds of climate impacts. As that 62% number goes up, and as the impacts continue getting worse, um, the reaction can get ugly in that sense, especially from a small government conservative point of view. If you want to avoid situations where the choices of individuals are going to be much more constrained, that's one example, right? Another one might even be with regards to housing and zoning, and what kinds of houses can people live in, right? Again, these are choices which I do not want government making. I'm a Green New Dealer. I want government to not be involved in determining, uh, and mandating that a certain kind of house is a house that nobody can live in, right? But again, that's the kind of decision which might become very serious. It might be something that people are seriously considering a few decades from now when they are desperate. And that's not all, right? What about where people live? Sure, most people are going to be escaping from zones where there is very high risk from climate events and where they are, you know, people are going to be escaping from the coastline, right? But on the other hand, some people are going to choose not to, right? Um, and in my view, I feel terrible for them. I would like to create every incentive to help them. I'd offer them money to get out of the danger zone, but I think an individual has the right to take certain risks with their own life. I don't think that the state should tell individuals not to. But I tell you something: the more people are dying, the greater the temptation will be to actively determine where people can live and where people cannot live, to force people out of their homes. I don't think that's a step we should necessarily take. I don't think it's a step we should take, even as a Green New Dealer on the left, right? If you want to avoid a situation where that is very tempting to a lot of people who are very desperate, who are seeing far too many of their fellow citizens dying every year, every day, every year. Too many people are dying every year in 2050. What do people do next? So on the mitigation and the adaptation side, we're talking about higher costs of government actions, right? If we don't act now. We're talking about more intrusive actions that are certainly going to be considered the more desperate the situation gets. In many ways, I haven't even gone into, right? We're talking about a larger influx of immigrants, of migrants, refugees. Again, we're going to have a discussion about that. I'm going to disagree with the position you're going to take about what we should do about that. But one point where I think we can agree on is that the larger the climate disruption is, the more people are going to be coming in. And if you don't like that, again, there's something that we can do. There is. The actions that we've taken so far, when I say that they have been highly consequential and highly insufficient, here's what I mean. Before the Paris Accords, the projections were that we were headed to 4 to 6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century. Scientists could not even fathom how humans would be able to live on this planet if there were 4 degrees of warming over pre-industrial levels, and they really could not fathom how we'd be able to live on this planet if we got to 6 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. What we have done with consequential and insufficient actions is we've brought the projections down, we've brought the range down from 4 to 6 to 2.4 to 3.2 degrees. That's a big deal. It's also not something we should be complacent about for two reasons. One is that we are learning that the impacts, even at 2, 2.4, and 3, are much worse than we previously thought. Even from 2014 to 2020, we've learned that the impacts were much worse at each degree, at each half degree, at each interval than we thought it was, right? Secondly, because of positive feedback loops. Now, again, sometimes the point of a positive feedback loops is taken too far. It's taken by fatalists and nihilists to the point where it's like, oh, well, because of climate feedback loops, this is uncontrollable. There's nothing we can do. We're fucked as fucked can be, right? But the truth is that because of climate feedback loops, we have the risk that if we do not keep warming below a certain level, and below the lowest level we possibly can keep it, there's a higher and higher risk that in the next 1,000 years, over the next 1,000 years, it gets hotter in a non-linear way. So it doesn't just go from 2 to 3, but it goes from maybe 2 to 3 to 7 or something, and maybe not right away. But the point is that, especially because these feedback loops are interrelated, the more we do to avoid setting them off, the better. Now, some people try to draw a line and say, this is the year where we trigger all of this stuff. And I think that's a mistake, because we don't know exactly how much more how many more emissions and how many more years we have. We know one thing though. We know that there is greater risk the less we do, and that needs to be a key takeaway here. But anyway, we have the ability to do this. We have the geophysical ability to do this. The question is whether we have the will.